Wayne with you. It's good to be able to reflect on policy. And the federal government has had very little policy discussion due to the ongoing distractions. Media's certainly been driving that. But maybe for Scott Morrison on the front foot, because the Prime Minister is in Adelaide today. And it's with the backdrop where the South Australian Labor opposition leader Peter Malinauskas is saying that the Prime Minister must shore up South Australia's submarine jobs. He might also think about shoring up the future of our defence in the Pacific by putting nuclear energy in those submarines. I mean, everybody else does, so why on earth aren't we? Well, that's because of some outdated policy from the 80s that needs to be reviewed. And it's interesting, the South Australian Chamber of Mines and Energy, Rebecca Knoll, who spoke with us on Tuesday, spoke about the very real issue of the nuclear question and that we need to be talking about it. Well, John McDonnell in his article today has taken up this with nuclear energy is suddenly getting a lot more attention. It was raised at the National Party conference at the weekend and there was strong support for this being put back on the agenda. The Labor Party also is going to be reviewing that. And recently a book appeared edited by Professor Tom Frame of the University of New South Wales entitled An Australian Nuclear Industry, Starting with Submarines as the question. And the book was based on papers delivered at a seminar held by the Submarine Institute of Australia. And the people who attended that seminar were mainly proponents of nuclear power, but with views they expressed are currently being reflected in discussions with the American defence establishment, and this is something that the Australian government has been having with them. The reservations that the Pentagon has with Australia's French-built nuclear projects are summed up in Commodore Dennis Moll's chapter in the book. And John quotes, "Nuclear submarines can be highly effective in open ocean and focal points, whereas conventional submarines are relatively effective only in focal points. The key question is considering whether to opt for nuclear submarines must be how important it is for our submarines to operate in the open ocean and how much it is worth to do that." I think that says a lot about the nuclear option in that question. And John writes, "It's becoming clear that the US view is that Australia's submarine fleet must be capable of operating in the open ocean if it is to play a useful role in protecting Australia's Indian Ocean sea lanes from Chinese intervention." However, as the article in Australian Defence magazine by Ewan Leverick shows, it is not as straightforward as might be expected. Australia lacks nuclear infrastructure and skilled workers necessary to support a nuclear naval industry. Leverick argues that we would have to build at least 2 conventional attack-class submarines while we are gearing up to have a nuclear industry. And this accords with the timeframe for the advent of a civil small modular nuclear reactor for domestic power generation if this policy approach was adopted, says John. Leverick points to a number of issues that would need to be addressed. Firstly, a decision would have to be made on where the Australian uranium that is to be used as nuclear fuel would be enriched. The simplest solution would be for it to be enriched in the United States or France in the short term, which have programs already. Leverick says building or importing nuclear infrastructure and know-how is possible, but it would require time and significant political backbone to convince the sceptical public that the cost and risk is necessary. And as polls taken during the last federal election showed, defence is low on the public's list of priorities. It would also require Australia to convince a foreign supplier that it can safely operate nuclear submarines and infrastructure. That's not a quick process. John's article goes on and explains further about the nuclear industry and how we could have a power generation industry which may be higher on the public's agenda of topics, particularly if they save money on their electricity. Ultimately, they may be more interested in their hip pocket than they are on defending the borders of the nation. It is a really good article at FlowNews24. Rikki Lambert will join me. We'll take a look at the South Australian Chamber of Mines and Energy and get their view on submarines and on nuclear energy. It really is something that we can follow through this morning, and it's an important one with the Prime Minister being in Adelaide and him being questioned by the state Labor opposition about shoring up the submarine building program. As a backdrop, John McDonnell in his earlier article wrote about it, and I thought I'd get Rikki Lambert from FlowNews24 to come and discuss it. Rikki, how are you?
Oh, great, thank you.
And this topic, you've actually spent some time in federal politics as a advisor to various politicians, and as a result, you've investigated the topic of nuclear energy at some degree and at some length.
I certainly have, Wayne, and one reason for that is that we often, when I was there with senators representing South Australia, you'd have our Victorian and New South Wales friends throwing mud at us saying, you keep wanting handouts to bail out South Australia, you want the defence industry to be based there because you can't create your own economy. Well, the federal legislation bans nuclear energy, bans nuclear power, and South Australia is a uranium superpower in my view when it comes to the amount of reserves we have. This is the way South Australia can pull its way in the nation and in fact export energy to the rest of the country.
So if we go back a step here, when I was a young boy a long time ago, and I think I'm slightly older than you, Rikki, so I can recall that it was all about these nuclear missiles are pointed at each other and the Cold War was going on, and as a result Peter Garrett and Midnight Oil, they got in the protest and we all began to say no to nuclear, no, no, no. Well, let's go to what the South Australian Chamber of Mines and Energy's Rebecca Knoll has to say about the discussion about nuclear energy.
We feel that it is time to have a mature conversation about nuclear. We produce a lot of the world's uranium and it comes from South Australia, and yet we've been afraid to have a conversation about the use of nuclear in our energy mix.
So there Rebecca talks about the fact that we should have a conversation. Should there be a conversation today when we talk about the Prime Minister of Australia being in Adelaide? Peter Malinauskas is the leader of the Labor opposition in South Australia, calling on the Prime Minister to shore up the submarine project. Should the Prime Minister go on the front foot and basically put out there that we're going to have a good look at nuclear subs?
I think that would be a really good approach. When you look at the Labor opposition leader here in South Australia has said, well, we want hydrogen to be the source of our energy mix in future. That's very energy intensive to even use hydrogen for energy purposes. This would be a way to say, well, there's a clear option for South Australia that would mean that you could stand on your own 2 feet using and renewing your own uranium for nuclear power, and then you wouldn't necessarily need all the propping up through the defence industry.
You mentioned a little bit about South Australia and having our way of paying our way in the nation, and we've got clearly the supply of uranium. Here's what the Chamber of Commerce's Rebecca Knoll, here's what the South Australian Chamber of Mines and Energy's Rebecca Knoll had to say on that point.
Yeah, we have got enormous uranium reserves. South Australia is a world-class uranium province. We host 25% of the world's uranium resources and 80% of Australia's uranium. So Olympic Dam is the single largest known uranium deposit in the world and the 4th largest copper mine. It is a key economic contributor to South Australia, bringing in about 118 million in royalties over the past 10 years. The Olympic Dam is well known as a key source of uranium, but we also have other uranium mines in the state, so it is really important for South Australia.
So, Rikki, in her discussions with you, do you foresee that there'll be a lot of opposition here? Do you think the public's ready for a discussion about nuclear subs to start with and maybe even enriching uranium in Australia so that we actually can take advantage of what we have?
Yeah, that comment from her comes from a longer form interview I had, which is on the FlowNews24 podcast channel, and it'll play on Country Viewpoint in the coming days. So I invite listeners to check that out if they want to hear the full details, where I did ask her about Fukushima and Chernobyl, and she made a very important point of difference by saying what they're talking about for the future is what's called small modular nuclear reactors, which she says is the size of a shipping container, very modular and able to be deployed, say, in an outback community to provide their energy needs, or to a mine or somewhere that is in a remote location. So they're not talking about something that you had in Fukushima, which was a large facility that ruptured on a tectonic plate. We're talking about sort of putting something the size of a shipping container out in a remote area so that it can provide their energy needs.
I'm wondering whether or not it will be enough interest to deflect the conversation to policy. We've seen that the ALP at a federal level yesterday has announced at its webinar conference that it's got some ideas about manufacturing, but we do need cheaper energy for that to occur. Will the Prime Minister go on the front foot and make some genuine announcements in the coming days? And maybe South Australia, when the great Tom Playford back in the 1950s decided that it would produce a massive power plant at Port Augusta, it was that which enabled it to build cars and so forth. Could it happen again?
Well, what we're hearing right now off the back of the pandemic is a talk about energy security. We'll cover that, I think, again tomorrow when it comes to lithium, and the need for us to have energy security for South Australia to develop our own industry, because you get China becomes a superpower in some respects and can restrict supply or affect supply of these very important minerals. We have the resource here in Australia that will enable us to have a manufacturing revolution.
We're going to watch with interest where this does go today. We'll have more updates for you on our news bulletins and on Country Viewpoint later, plus tomorrow when Rikki Lambert will join me again with another interesting topic on the Flow Morning Show.